This is case 542 that JT sent me. We'll be doing an analysis of this. You can see from the radiographs he submitted, it's a molar tooth with a large periapical radiolucency. This is his diagnosis page. So there was a furcal breakdown as well as a lateral root lesion. These are his measurements and pulpal findings. He gives the history here. He did use the general wave molar handpiece on it. He did visualize a crack. The sinus tract went away, but then came back. So he extracted the tooth. These are his clinical photos. And the case presents unique problems because it's been filled, which makes it difficult to detect what effect the general wave actually had. Sometimes you can gain some information from cases like this, and I believe we did here a little bit. So this is how I got the tooth. The tooth came extracted in sections, and you can see the distal canal, the fracture going right into the distal canal. And so it was an opportunity to actually look at a wild type of biofilm in a fracture case, which we don't do very often, so it was kind of interesting. This is looking at it from the back molar perspective, looking at the fracture lines. So this first section is just looking at familiarizing yourself with the pattern recognition for natural biofilms in root fractures. And you're going to need this kind of pattern recognition when we look at the distal and mesial buccal root. So when we actually go in there and look at the biofilm that's present in that fracture, it gives you a pretty good idea of what a natural biofilm, how a natural biofilm actually looks. So you're going to need this kind of pattern recognition when we look at the other roots. So you can see it doesn't look like your typical planktonic bacteria. And it's very easy to mistake this for a smear layer and debris on the smear layer. So it's useful having some kind of recognition. We ran into this problem with a paper we did with Dr. Costerton, looking at biofilms in necrotic teeth. This is a concept imaging. These are the original images from that proof of concept when we're actually trying to see if we could actually detect what intracanal biofilms look like. And when we went in there, it's not immediately obvious that these are biofilms unless you have experience in looking at natural biofilms. So we used an EUB338 RNA molecular probe, which basically stains all organisms in the domain of bacteria, and it's lit up with red. So you can see this is actually a biofilm. So we didn't use the EUB stain here because we already have pretty good pattern recognition skills on what biofilms look like. So we decided to fracture away the lingual part of that cusp so we could look at the axial view of this biofilm, and this is what the section looks like. I want to get you familiar with how we section these teeth, because if you don't understand that, you won't really understand what you're looking at. So you're actually looking at the axial wall of that fracture, and you can see how the biofilm moves from the exterior into the distal canal. And it's kind of a unique perspective on how to look at these biofilms. So this is a natural wild type biofilm on the axial wall of that fracture. And when you go into it, you get a sense for what these biofilms actually look like. So when we go into the other parts of the root in JT's case, this kind of perspective will be helpful for you in recognizing what you're actually looking at. And when you look at these, you gain a sense that there's some organisms here, but there's so much EPS that it's difficult to actually detect individual organisms, which are really the sign of a bacterial biofilm. And here is interesting. You can actually see where the bacteria start leaking into the distal canal. And you can kind of get a sense for how those biofilms might actually appear in nature. So when you look at where the fracture actually enters into the distal canal, and then you go ahead and look at how those biofilms appear, you get a sense for the kind of structures that they make. So you have a lot. Now this has been separated, so it's been torn open when we fractured the tooth to look at the axial wall. But you can actually see these biofilms make a kind of structure. And this reminded me very much of work that we did when I had Paul Webster out. He was actually able to image these by removing the EPS material to actually observe what kind of structures these were. This is Paul Webster. He was out at a meeting and he lectured briefly to us. And this is his work showing these structures when the EPS material is removed, and you can actually see what these structures actually look like. The structures are made out of a proteoglycan, glycosaminoglycan type structure, and then the biofilms are in this EPS. So when you compare this, you have kind of a mind's eye of what these structures must really look like. So now that you have that, we're going to look at the distal root analysis next, and then we'll look at the mesial root in part 2 and 3.